The gavel came down like thunder. Bang. Papers lifted into the air as if startled birds. The clerk flinched, scattering her pen across the table. At the center of the storm, Margaret Lewis slammed her palm against the cold oak surface, the veins on her hand rising sharp against her pale skin. Her voice cracked, yet cut through the silence like glass. She called me a kidnapper of my own grandson. The words lingered in the courtroom like smoke, impossible to wave away. A collective intake of breath followed, rows of spectators leaning forward, reporters' pens scratching furiously. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, relentless, casting a sterile glow that made every wrinkle on Margaret's face sharper, every tremor in her voice more undeniable. Her throat felt dry, raw, like she had swallowed copper. The taste of metal pressed against the back of her tongue, and her heartbeat pounded so loudly she feared it might be heard through the microphone clipped near the witness stand. Across the aisle, Ashley Morgan, her former daughter-in-law, tightened her grip on the table edge, nails biting into wood. Her eyes, painted with a thin layer of courtroom-appropriate mascara, widened for just a second before narrowing into practiced indignation. But it was too late. Margaret's words had already detonated. The bronze nameplate on the judge's bench reflected the red light of the court camera. The engraving glinted like a brand. Margaret Lewis v. Cast you, Ashley Morgan. It seemed to pulse, almost alive, under the tension in the air. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his boots squeaking against the polished floor. Somewhere in the gallery, a muffled cough broke the hush, but the silence that followed was heavier, pressing against everyone's chest. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on Ashley, the woman who had once entered her family as a bride, but now sat opposite her as an adversary. In those eyes, Margaret thought she still saw the shadow of betrayal, the smirk behind the mask of victimhood. Her hand trembled on the table, but she clenched it into a fist, the wood biting into her knuckles. This was not the trembling of weakness. It was the trembling before battle. The memory of that morning came rushing back. The school bus door screeching open, the shrill of children's laughter, the tiny hand of her grandson slipping into hers, trusting, innocent. And then, Ashley's accusation, sharp as a knife, "You're taking him without permission. This is abduction." The sting of the word abduction had never left her ears. Now, standing in this courtroom, Margaret knew she had to carve those words out of her life forever. She leaned closer to the microphone, voice steadier this time, as if willing the record to carry her truth. "Imagine, Your Honor, being branded a criminal for holding the hand of the boy you raised when his mother was gone." Her voice cracked again, but not with fragility, with force. Each syllable landed like a hammer blow. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Journalists scribbled faster, some eyes darting to the glowing REC sign above the camera. This was the moment they would print tomorrow, the line that would make headlines. Ashley shifted in her seat, lips pressing into a thin line. She tried to steady herself, but her voice betrayed her with the faintest quiver. She was acting erratic. The school had a protocol. "I feared for my son's safety." The judge raised a hand for order, but Margaret didn't wait for permission. Her palm struck the table again. Crack. Sixth. Protocol? You think protocol gives you the right to call a grandmother a kidnapper? You poisoned my name, Ashley. You tried to erase me from my grandson's life. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Even the court reporter paused, her stenograph keys stilled under her fingers. The bronze nameplate gleamed again, the words, Lewis v. Morgan, catching the sterile light. It stood not just as a case file, but as a battle line. Bloodline against bloodline, truth against fabrication. Margaret drew in a deep breath, her chest heaving. Every detail in the room sharpened. The faint hum of the air conditioning. The cool slickness of the oak beneath her palm. The way her own pulse thudded in her ears like a war drum. This wasn't just about $20,000. This wasn't just about a lawsuit. This was about identity. This was about survival. Her grandson's face flashed in her mind. Brown curls, wide eyes, the way he once called her Nana and clung to her skirt. That memory was the fire in her lungs now, fueling every word. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, "this case is not about custody. It is not about protocol. It is about the truth. And the truth is that Ashley Morgan accused me of a crime I never committed because she knew the accusation itself would stain me, whether proven or not." The judge's gavel struck again, order in the court, but no one moved. The silence was no longer shock. It was anticipation. The spectators, the reporters, even the bailiff holding his breath, they all sensed it. Something larger than a family dispute was unfolding here. Margaret looked once more at Ashley. Her gaze was not pleading, not maternal, but merciless. Purr. "Actions have consequences, Ashley. Even yours." The words echoed against the walls, bounced through the microphones, etched themselves into the court transcript. They were not just spoken, they were branded. And then? CUT. The camera panned back, the bronze nameplate filling the frame one last time, burning under the red glow of the recording light. Lewis B. Morgan, Bloodlines on Trial. The screen went black. Ashley Morgan rose slowly from her seat. The wood of the bench creaked beneath her, but her body language was carefully rehearsed, measured, deliberate. She smoothed the skirt of her navy dress, then placed a trembling hand on the railing of the witness stand. The faint quiver in her fingers was visible, magnified by the camera's zoom. Her face looked pale under the courtroom lights, but not weak, strategically fragile. She glanced at the jury with eyes that glistened as if they were perpetually on the edge of tears. When she spoke, her voice was hushed, strained, as though she had to force each word past a throat constricted with fear. "I only wanted to protect my son." Mrs. Lewis acted erratic. She resisted school protocol. The words erratic and protocol hung in the air, striking the courtroom with the precision of a carefully sharpened blade. Several heads in the gallery nodded reflexively. One reporter scribbled the phrase in bold letters across his notepad. Erratic. Protocol. Ashley clasped her hands together now, fingers twisting in a ballet of nervousness. She shook her head faintly, like a mother recalling a nightmare she never wanted to relive. "It was terrifying," she continued, her voice faltering at just the right moment. "I thought my child was being taken without authorization." She refused to listen to the bus driver. She resisted the rules. What was I supposed to think? The prosecutor leaned forward at this cue, tapping his pen against his notes before rising. His voice carried smoothly, a steady echo of Ashley's performance. The child was endangered. That is the crux of this case. Protocol exists for a reason. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Cameras clicked in succession, capturing Ashley's downcast expression, the worried wrinkle of her brow, the trembling lip. But at the clerk's table, the stenographer's hands hesitated mid-stroke. The rhythmic clatter of her machine stuttered, then resumed, as though even the act of typing erratic, resisting, protocol, left a faint aftertaste of disbelief. A court officer sitting near the door shifted in his chair, exchanging a quick glance with another. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but enough to seed unease. Ashley's lawyer approached, placing a gentle hand on the rail. "Ms. Morgan, could you please explain to the court why you were so concerned that day?" Ashley inhaled sharply, performing the gesture of someone summoning courage to relive trauma. "Because I know what happens when rules aren't followed," she whispered. "Children disappear, spakes happen, and when Mrs. Bocking race, Lewis pushed past protocol, she put my son in danger. I had no choice but to act." "Shh." She raised her chin slightly, allowing her words to roll across the courtroom. Her gaze flickered toward the jury, scanning for sympathy, planting seeds of maternal fear. "This wasn't about malice," she said, shaking her head. "This was about a mother's instinct. I saw erratic behavior. I saw resistance to the system meant to protect us. I acted because no one else would." The words sounded almost noble, heroic in their delivery. And like an echo chamber, the gallery responded, nodding heads, pursed lips, a collective hum of understanding. The phrase returned, like a refrain, erratic, resisting, protocol. Margaret Lewis sat motionless, her hands folded tightly on her lap. From where she sat, she could hear the whispering echo of those words circling like vultures. Each repetition was a stab wound, reopening the accusation she had carried since the day Ashley first uttered it. Her jaw tightened. She did not interrupt. Not yet. Ashley leaned further into her performance, voice growing steadier, gaining confidence with every sympathetic nod from the gallery. "I remember looking into my son's eyes that morning," she said, clutching the rail. He looked confused, afraid. He didn't understand why his grandmother was pulling him away. That moment, her voice cracked deliberately. That moment, I thought I might lose him forever. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys again, capturing every word, but the stenographer's lips pressed together tightly, as though she herself resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Still, the performance worked. Ashley dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her movements delicate, almost theatrical. She held the tissue for an extra beat, making sure the cameras caught the image. The protective mother, vulnerable yet resolute, standing against an elder who had crossed the line. The prosecutor paced slowly before the jury box. "Sept. Ladies and gentlemen, you must understand, rules and protocols are not optional. They are designed to safeguard children. When someone acts erratic, when someone resists those rules, alarms must be raised." He pointed lightly toward Margaret, not with aggression, but with implication. The gesture was subtle enough to avoid objection, but sharp enough to linger in the jurors' minds. "This case is about responsibility," he said. "About what happens when we ignore the very systems that keep our children safe." Ashley bowed her head slightly, a saint in mourning. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder as if to anchor her courage. But Margaret noticed something different. A flicker in Ashley's expression. Too rehearsed, too precise. Like an actress who had practiced her lines in front of the mirror until each sob landed on cue. And others noticed too. The stenographer's momentary freeze, the bailiff's exchanged glance, the court officer's shifting boots, tiny cracks forming in the porcelain mask of Ashley Morgan. Yet the narrative had taken root. The words had been spoken, repeated, branded into the official record. Erratic, resisting, protocol. Dake, reporters whispered to one another. She said erratic. Did you catch that? Erratic. A journalist underlined it 3 times in his notebook. The camera light glowed red. The story was already halfway written. Ashley lowered her eyes, her voice soft but firm, as if granting herself the final line of a soliloquy. I never wanted to accuse anyone, but when a grandmother resists protocol and acts in such an erratic way, I had no choice but to call it what it was, a potential kidnapping. I did it to protect my son. The room exhaled as she stepped back, her words saturating the silence like perfume. For a moment, it felt as though she had won the entire courtroom. But behind her, Margaret Lewis sat unmoving, her eyes burning with the promise of a truth yet to come. The room had just finished absorbing Ashley Morgan's trembling testimony when the judge turned his gaze to the other table. The air still carried the scent of tears and sympathy, the echo of erratic, resisting, protocol, ringing like a chorus that refused to fade. But now it was Margaret Lewis's turn. The grandmother rose slowly, every movement measured, deliberate. Unlike Ashley, she didn't smooth her dress or dab at non-existent tears. She simply adjusted the collar of her gray blazer and stood straight, her spine rigid, her presence commanding. There was no trace of hysteria in her expression, no wavering lip, no trembling hand. Just the cool, sharp calm of a storm that had not yet broken. She placed both hands lightly on the table, then lifted her chin to meet the judge's eyes. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried. Every syllable landed with the precision of a struck bell. Your Honor, I request a preservation order for all bus surveillance footage. And I remind this court of Brady v. Fires PACMA, Maryland. The words detonated like a controlled explosion. The jury stirred. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Even the prosecutor blinked, his carefully rehearsed rhythm interrupted. Brady v. Maryland. The phrase hung heavy in the air, not as a plea but as a weapon, a landmark case, a constitutional safeguard, a reminder that exculpatory evidence must never be withheld. The shift in tone was immediate. Ashley's testimony had filled the courtroom with fevered emotion, whispers, nods, sympathetic sighs. But Margaret's statement sliced clean through the fog, bringing the focus back to cold, undeniable law. The judge adjusted his glasses, leaning forward slightly. Mrs. Lewis, are you formally moving for a preservation order? Margaret inclined her head, her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, I request immediate preservation of the school bus surveillance footage from the morning in question. Under Brady, such material constitutes potential exculpatory evidence. A hush spread across the room, followed by a ripple of murmurs. This wasn't the language of a victim pleading for sympathy. This was the language of authority, of someone who knew exactly where to strike. The court stenographer, who had earlier faltered under Ashley's melodrama, now straightened. Her fingers flew confidently across the keys, recording every word as though aware this testimony mattered differently, sharper, weightier. Ashley shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her carefully arranged fragility didn't seem to fit against the steel of Margaret's composure. She fiddled with her tissue, but no one was watching her now. All eyes had turned to Margaret. The prosecutor cleared his throat, stepping forward. Your Honor, I must object to the relevance of citing Brady v. Maryland at this stage. But the judge cut him off with a raised hand. Overruled. The witness may continue. Margaret's eyes flickered briefly toward the prosecutor, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't triumph. It was inevitability. She turned back to the bench. The accusation before this court hinges on perception. Ms. Morgan has painted me as erratic, as resisting, as someone indifferent to protocol. Yet there exists objective evidence. A camera mounted above the bus door. That footage will show the truth. It will show whether I acted erratic, whether I resisted, or whether I followed every protocol she claims I violated. The repetition was deliberate. She wielded Ashley's chosen words, erratic, resisting, protocol, not as daggers against herself, but as blades turned back upon their owner. The audience murmured louder this time. Reporters leaned forward. One whispered to another, "She's flipping the narrative." "She's not begging, she's building a case." Margaret paused just long enough for silence to settle again. Then she continued, her voice still calm but with a quiet intensity that made the gallery lean closer. This court deserves clarity, not performance. It deserves evidence, not embellishment. That is why Brady matters here. Because when accusations become weapons, truth is the only shield. The gavel tapped lightly as the judge sought to quiet the growing stir in the gallery. But Margaret was not finished. She stepped slightly closer to the microphone, her eyes never leaving the bench. Q. Your Honor, I respect this court too much to allow it to be swayed by theatrics. I will not cry. I will not collapse. I will not spin words into webs. I will give you facts, law, and evidence. That is all. The jury shifted again, their earlier empathy for Ashley faltering. Margaret's poise was not dramatic, not manipulative. It was unnerving in its precision. Ashley's lawyer sprang up. Objection, Your Honor. This is grandstanding. The judge shook his head. Overruled. Mrs. Lewis may proceed. Margaret's gaze slid briefly toward Ashley. For the first time, Ashley's mask cracked. Her jaw clenched, and the corners of her eyes twitched. The grandmother allowed the silence to stretch, savoring the imbalance. Then she ended with a line that cut through the room like a blade through glass. Fart braiders. We will speak of my profession soon enough. The words dropped into the silence like stones into water, rippling outward, unsettling everything they touched. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Her profession? Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. One muttered, Is she a lawyer? Another scribbled frantically, circling the phrase profession 3 times in ink. The judge raised his gavel, striking twice for order. Bang, 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 silence in the court. But the damage, or perhaps the design, was done. The hook had been set. The air buzzed with anticipation. Margaret hadn't just defended herself. She had reridden the battlefield. Ashley sank back into her chair, eyes darting nervously. Her earlier aura of maternal sacrifice now looked flimsy against the steel of Margaret's resolve. The tissue in her hand crumpled, its edges shredded by restless fingers. Margaret returned to her seat with the quiet dignity of someone who knew the war was far from over, but had already turned the tide. For the first time since the trial began, the balance of power had shifted, and the jury felt it. The reporters felt it. Ashley felt it most of all. The lie had been planted, yes, but Margaret had just watered the soil with something far more dangerous. Truth, sharpened by law, waiting to bloom. The courtroom held its breath. The echoes of Margaret Lewis's last words, "We will speak of my profession soon enough," still lingered in the rafters when she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. The gallery leaned forward instinctively, as if pulled by a string. Even the judge, gavel still in hand, paused mid-motion. Margaret's fingers brushed the leather wallet she carried close to her chest, the one no one had seen until now. She drew it out with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment not once, but 1,000 times in her mind. The leather caught the fluorescent light. She flicked it open. A small, rectangular card glimmered under the sterile brightness. Its golden edge reflected a halo of authority. The emblem of the United States Federal Bar gleamed in the center, flanked by embossed lettering that declared her identity beyond doubt. She stepped forward. The slow click of her heels echoed like drumbeats. The judge's chair scraped faintly as he rose from the bench. He did not speak. He simply stepped aside, yielding space he had never before ceded in his own courtroom. Margaret placed the card on the polished wood surface before him. The sound of it, soft but final, was louder than Ashley's entire testimony had been. Her voice did not tremble. It did not rise. It did not need to. Attorney Lewis and grandmother. The room froze. For several seconds, silence became its own language. The stenographer's keys lay untouched, her hands hovering uselessly above them. Reporters stared wide-eyed, their pens hovering above notepads, ink dripping into stillness. The gallery's collective breath turned into a vacuum, pulling all sound out of the chamber. The only motion came from the red recording light of the court camera, blinking faithfully, capturing everything. And then, ever so slightly, the camera operator panned, zooming in on Ashley Morgan's face. Her skin had drained of color. The faint blush carefully applied that morning seemed to evaporate under the heat of truth. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her mascara-lined eyes widened, exposing the whites, glassy with disbelief. She looked not like a mother protecting her son, but like a child caught red-handed in a lie too elaborate to sustain. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice lower than before, tempered with gravity. Mrs. Lewis, or rather, Attorney Lewis, you failed to disclose this to the court earlier. Margaret inclined her head, her tone respectful but unyielding. Your Honor, I believed it prudent to let Ms. Wedge Morgan present her version first. It was important for this court to witness the narrative she wove before I revealed the capacity in which I stand. Her words struck with clinical precision, dissecting Ashley's performance into a mere fabrication. Ashley's lawyer sprang to his feet. Objection, this is highly irregular. The judge silenced him with a single raised hand. Sit down, counselor. The court will hear her. Margaret reached for her card once more, turning it gently so that the jury could see the seal glint under the lights. Yes, I am a grandmother. That will never change. But I'm also an attorney, licensed by the federal bar, sworn to uphold justice. I know the weight of accusations. I know the power of words when weaponized. And I will not stand by while falsehoods redefine my name or rob my grandson of the truth. The gallery buzzed, unable to contain itself. Whispers ricocheted against the walls. She's a lawyer, she's an attorney, she's not just a grandmother. The bailiff called for silence, his booming voice barely audible above the rising tide of astonishment. Ashley finally found her voice, though it cracked like thin glass. This isn't fair. She's using her position. Margaret turned her gaze on her, calm, almost pitying. No, Ashley, I'm using the truth. Ashley recoiled, her chair scraping backward with a screech that made the gallery wince. The cameras caught every twitch of her face, every frantic glance toward her attorney who now sat rigid, as if calculating the cost of continuing. Margaret stepped back from the bench, leaving her card where it lay. The golden edge glimmered, an unspoken testament. For the first time, the balance of power did not simply tilt, it collapsed entirely onto her side. The courtroom, once saturated with sympathy for Ashley's trembling words, now vibrated with awe, tension, and an unshakable sense of inevitability. Reporters scribbled furiously, headlines writing themselves in real time. Grandmother reveals, she is attorney, trial turns on its head. The jury exchanged glances, their earlier pity dissolving into wary respect. They no longer looked at Margaret as a frail woman accused of abduction. They looked at her as a force of law, cloaked not in emotion, but in authority. The judge finally reclaimed his seat, his gavel resting quietly at his side. His tone softened, no longer authoritative but almost deferential. Attorney Lewis, please proceed. Margaret inclined her head once more, her expression steady. She returned to her seat, the heels of her shoes clicking with finality, the sound echoing like punctuation at the end of a long, damning sentence. Ashley sat frozen. Her tissue lay shredded in her lap, mascara beginning to streak beneath her eyes. The cameras lingered on her face, capturing the moment the mask slipped completely. And somewhere deep in her chest, Ashley Morgan realized what the rest of the courtroom already knew. The performance was over. The truth had entered the stage. The courtroom darkened. The blinds were drawn. The fluorescent lights dimmed, leaving only the glow of the projection screen. A hush fell over the gallery as the bailiff wheeled in the monitor, the red REC light blinking faintly at its edge. Margaret Lewis remained standing at the counsel's table, her posture unwavering. She did not look at the jury, nor at Ashley. She kept her eyes fixed on the screen, as though she already knew what was about to unfold. The judge adjusted his microphone. Play the exhibit. A soft crackle filled the air. Then, the grainy black and white footage of the school bus interior flickered to life. There it was, the morning in question. Children in backpacks chattered, their voices muffled by the poor quality of the microphone. The bus door squealed open, and then Margaret appeared. No frenzy, no erratic gestures, no forced resistance. Just a grandmother leaning in gently, her hand extended toward her grandson, the boy's small fingers wrapped around hers with easy trust. Together, they stepped off the bus, calm, measured, ordinary. Silence dominated the room. And then, faint but clear, the driver's voice captured by the audio feed. Mrs. Lewis signed the release form. It's all in protocol. The gallery erupted. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Reporters scrambled to jot the line down, their pens scratching furiously across paper. The stenographer's keys clattered faster, trying to catch every syllable. Ashley's face drained of color. The footage froze mid-frame. Margaret's hand clasping her grandson's, both figures outlined in a halo of light at the bus door. Margaret stepped forward. Float. Vote. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is the reality, Miss Product. Morgan has tried to bury beneath her words. Not erratic, not resisting, and certainly not abduction. Every act I made was within protocol. She let the words sink in, then motioned to the technician. Rewind. Pause at the form. The footage rolled back. The camera zoomed in on the clipboard in the driver's hand, Margaret's signature visible, bold against the lined sheet. You see my name there? Hugh Com, USBA. You hear the driver confirm it. This was not a crime. This was procedure. The repetition struck like hammer blows. Procedure, protocol, truth. But Margaret wasn't finished. She walked toward the evidence table, retrieving a folder thick with affidavits. She opened it with a snap and pulled out a single sheet. Now, let us address the testimony submitted by Ms. Morgan's supporting witness. She held it up for the court to see, the sworn statement of a fellow parent who had claimed they saw Margaret dragging the child from the bus. Margaret's tone was razor-sharp as she turned toward the witness stand. Sector, Mr. Dalton, please take the stand. A middle-aged man shuffled forward, his face drawn, shoulders slumped. He avoided Margaret's eyes as he swore the oath. Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking like a metronome of inevitability. Mr. Dalton, you signed this affidavit under penalty of perjury, did you not? His voice cracked. Why, yes. And in this affidavit, you claimed you witnessed me acting erratic and resisting protocol, correct? A bead of sweat slid down his temple. Yes. Margaret's eyes locked onto his. TX. Do you like to amend that statement now, Mr. Reisman? Now, Mr. Reisman's. Dalton? The room stilled. All eyes on him. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I didn't really see much. Ashley asked me to write it. She said it would help her case. I'm sorry, it wasn't true. The gallery gasped, voices erupting into chaotic whispers. The judge's gavel slammed down. Order. Order in the court. But the damage was done. The lie was gutted, exposed, dissected in real time. Margaret turned back to the jury, her voice calm, steady. There is your witness. A man pressured into fabricating a story, not because he saw truth, but because Mrs. MC. Morgan needed one. Ashley buried her face in her hands. Margaret moved to the podium again, her tone shifting from scalpel to hammer. Sack. Let us broaden our view, shall we? False allegations are not rare, as Ms. Morgan would have you believe. She flipped open another file, drawing out a printed report. The projector screen lit up once more, displaying numbers in stark black font. Out of 214 custody disputes last year in this county, 38 involved false allegations of abduction. She let the number hang in the air before continuing. T8. T8 families torn apart by lies. 38 children forced to choose sides in wars they never asked to fight. 38 reputations destroyed until the truth emerged. Her gaze swept the room. And today I stand before you as the 39th. Another grandmother accused, another child caught in the crossfire, another life poisoned by fabrication. The repetition was deliberate, driving the statistic into the marrow of the jury's understanding. Margaret motioned for the technician again. Oh! Roll the second clip. The monitor came alive once more. This time, the angle showed the bus driver filling out his end-of-day report. His voice was clear, calm, unhurried. Ch. Mrs. Lewis followed procedure. Release form signed. Child handed over properly. All in protocol. Pause. Zoom. The words, all in protocol, echoed like a refrain burning into the screen's subtitles. Margaret spoke again. 30 times now. The driver, the footage, the form. Protocol followed. Nothing erratic. Nothing resisted. Her cadence matched the rhythm of evidence itself. Precise, undeniable, unshakable. Ashley's lawyer leapt up, his voice strained. Your Honor, this is excessive. The judge cut him off sharply. Counselor, sit down. The evidence speaks for itself. Margaret turned back to the gallery. Her voice softened, almost mournful. I am not here only for myself. I am here because if we let lies take root, they do not simply ruin one person. They spread. They corrupt the very soil of justice. She held up the affidavit once more, then let it fall onto the table with a heavy slap. This was her weapon, a forged narrative, and now it lies in pieces. The jury stared at her, their expressions hardened, no longer neutral. Several nodded faintly, as though silently agreeing. The reporters scribbled faster, headlines practically writing themselves. Bus footage exonerates grandmother. False witness admits fabrication under oath. Courtroom. Stunned as numbers reveal epidemic of false accusations. Ashley sat hunched, her once polished composure shattered. She whispered frantically to her lawyer, but he had no words to give her. The cameras zoomed in, catching the tremor in her jaw, the sweat gathering along her hairline. Margaret, meanwhile, stood calm as stone. Her final words in this round rang with the force of prophecy. Sick. Lies unravel when the truth has its day in court. And today this courtroom belongs to the truth. The lights flickered back on. The monitor clicked to black, but the images remained seared into everyone's mind. Tiled, small hand in Margaret's. The driver's calm confirmation. The false witness's trembling confession. The cold, undeniable number. 38 false accusations before this one. To me! No one looked at Ashley Morgan the same way again. The lie had been shattered. The evidence now roared, and the courtroom braced itself for the bigger storm to come. The screen dimmed to black, but the weight of the footage still hung in the air. The jurors shifted in their seats. The gallery murmured in low disbelief, and Ashley Morgan sat in a silent collapse, her shoulders bent under the ruin of her own performance. Margaret Lewis did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply lowered her tone, forcing everyone to lean in, as if the truth itself whispered from her lips. She fixed her eyes on the judge, steady, unblinking. This is not just about me. This is about how family law is weaponized with false accusations. The words sank deep, heavier than any piece of evidence yet presented. The gavel in the judge's hand stilled. The jury's pens froze. Reporters lifted their heads. Margaret reached for the remote. The screen flickered alive again. This time, not with shaky footage, but with numbers, bold white against black. On the monitor, text appeared. 63%, custody disputes involving parental alienation. 41%, allegations dismissed for lack of evidence. She gestured toward the screen, her voice cutting through the dim light like a scalpel. Cards, these are not my numbers. They come from the Family Law Review Board of this very state. 63% of contested divorces or custody battles involve some form of parental alienation, a mother or father using the child as a pawn, and 41% of those accusations collapse under scrutiny because they were never built on truth. They were built on strategy. A murmur rippled across the gallery. Someone whispered too loudly, 41%? Margaret nodded, acknowledging the disbelief. Yes, 4 out of every 10, almost half. Imagine the damage. Reputations destroyed, children torn away from stable relationships, courts clogged with lies while genuine cases of danger drown in the noise. The red recording light blinked faithfully above the camera, locking every word into permanent record. Ashley's lawyer leapt up, desperate. Objection. Irrelevant statistics, Your Honor. But the judge's gavel struck down once. Overruled. Continue. Margaret turned toward the jury now, her voice gathering momentum, not in volume but in gravity. False. False accusations are not just personal attacks. They are systemic weapons. They exploit the cracks in family law. They exploit the presumption that fear must always be believed, even when facts contradict it. And when courts allow this weaponization to persist, it corrodes the very institution meant to protect families. Yes. Her eyes swept the 12 faces in the box, each gaze caught in her quiet fire. Today it is me. Tomorrow it may be you or someone you know, accused not because it is true, but because it is convenient. Because it wins custody. Because it shifts sympathy. Because it breaks an opponent when nothing else will. She clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to a stark headline. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Margaret let the letters hang for a moment before continuing. The Department of Justice knows this pattern well. They have intervened when systems, whether policing or family law, are repeatedly abused. They have issued consent decrees, binding agreements to reform practices where rights have been trampled. She let the phrase settle. Consent decrees, heavy, federal, inescapable. In the past decade, several states have been forced into such decrees because their family courts failed to protect the innocent. They failed to check false allegations. They allowed lies to dictate the futures of children. And when the DOJ steps in, it is because the system itself is no longer trusted to police its own failures. The gallery stirred. Reporters' pens flew. This was no longer a family squabble. This was systemic critique, federal gravity. Ashley whispered harshly to her attorney, but her words carried in the stunned silence. She's making me look like a criminal, a national example. Task. Margaret heard her, and her reply was merciless. Ducked. No, Ms. Morgan. You made yourself the example when you turned a falsehood into a weapon. I am only holding the mirror. Ashley's face flushed crimson. Margaret stepped closer to the jury, her tone quieter now, almost intimate. Do you know what happens to children in these cases? When a parent poisons their mind with lies about the other side, psychologists call it induced alienation. A child learns to fear love, to mistrust family, to believe safety is danger and danger is safety. That is the legacy of false accusations. Her hand trembled, not from weakness but from restraint as she lifted a photo of her grandson smiling in brighter days before the storm of lies. This is my grandson. He was not endangered that morning. He was endangered by the lie. He was endangered by being taught to fear the hand that raised him. The jury's eyes softened. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, his lips pressing into a thin line. Margaret straightened again, her voice rising just enough to break the tension. The law must not be a weapon. It must be a shield. And when it is twisted, when accusations become strategy, when families are shredded for leverage, then justice itself is kidnapped. She let the last word hang deliberately. Kidnapped, the echo of Ashley's original charge, turned back on her like a blade reversed. The gallery gasped. A reporter mouthed the words silently, already crafting the headline. By justice kidnapped, attorney grandmother exposes systemic abuse in family law. Ashley's attorney scrambled once more, his voice breaking. Your Honor, this is beyond the scope. But the judge raised his hand, silencing him again. No, it is within the scope, because this court does not exist in a vacuum. We are part of a system, and this system must face itself. His words fell like stone. For once, even the bench sided with Margaret's framing. Margaret closed the file, her hands calm. This is not a case of grandmother versus mother-in-law. This is not even just Lewis v. Morgan. This is every case where lies have been dressed as truth. Every time the word abduction has been thrown like a grenade into a family dispute. And unless we stop it, unless we demand evidence before sympathy, there will be a 40th case, and a 41st, and a 50th. And more children will grow up believing love is something to be feared. Gah! She let silence take over again. The weight of inevitability pressed against the chamber walls. Then, her final words of the round, slow and deliberate. This is not a personal flaw. This is a A design where envy parades as morality and where the truth is collateral damage. And I refuse to let my grandson be its next casualty. The gavel struck once, but it could not break the silence that followed. The numbers glowed on the screen behind her: 63%, 41%, DOJ, consent decrees, and for the first time, the courtroom seemed less like a chamber of local law and more like a stage on which an entire nation's broken system stood trial. The air in the courtroom had turned heavy, thick with anticipation. Each juror sat rigid in their chair, eyes fixed on the bench. The gallery leaned forward as though pulled by gravity. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to hush, awaiting the words that would either vindicate or condemn. The judge lifted the papers before him, spectacles perched low on his nose. He cleared his throat, his voice solemn, deliberate. In the matter of Margaret Lewis B. Ashley Morgan, this court finds the defendant, Ashley Morgan, guilty of defamation and malicious falsehood. W asked. A beat of silence. Then his gavel struck once, echoing like thunder. The damages awarded, $20,000 to Mrs. Lewis. The words fell into the courtroom like stone into still water, rippling outward, sending waves of reaction across every corner. Reporters bolted upright, scribbling furiously. The gallery gasped, then buzzed in a low roar. One mother in the back row whispered, "Finally, someone said it out loud." "Fire!" Ashley Morgan sat frozen, her mouth ajar, her face pale. The tissue in her hands had long since disintegrated into shreds, damp from nervous tears that were no longer believed. She shook her head slowly, as though refusing to let the verdict register. Margaret Lewis, however, remained perfectly still. She did not exhale in relief, nor did she smile in triumph. She simply turned her head slowly, deliberately, until her eyes locked on Ashley. The microphone on her table caught the low whisper that followed, amplifying it just enough for every corner of the room to hear. "For 2 years, you lied." Ashley flinched, as though struck. Margaret's gaze did not waver. Her voice, calm but piercing, continued. "For 2 years, you poisoned my grandson's heart." The gallery stirred again, the weight of her words heavy as lead. Each repetition was a nail hammered into the coffin of Ashley's deceit. Margaret's final refrain came like a blade, cutting the silence. "For 2 years, you thought you would never face consequences." The room stilled. No coughs, no murmurs, just the quiet thrum of inevitability. Ashley's attorney leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she did not respond. Her eyes darted wildly toward the jury box, toward the reporters, toward the cameras blinking their red lights. Everywhere she looked, she found judgment staring back at her. She opened her mouth, but no words came. No denial, no plea, only silence. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the storm inside her finally giving way to a profound calm. She was not gloating, not reveling. She was steady, composed, almost mournful, for she knew that while she had won, scars remained. Scars in her grandson's mind, scars in her family's history, scars that no dollar amount could erase. The judge struck his gavel again. "Sex, Jack. This court is adjourned." Chairs scraped as people rose. Reporters surged toward the aisle. The bailiff barked for order. The gallery erupted in overlapping voices. But above the chaos, Margaret's whisper lingered, echoing like scripture. A young reporter, barely out of college, turned to his colleague. "Did you hear that? She said it 3 times? For 2 years. That's the headline." Another journalist muttered, "No, the line is what she said after. That one will live forever." Because as Margaret gathered her documents, tucking the verdict slip neatly into her folder, she turned one last time toward Ashley. Her eyes, filled not with rage but with resolute clarity, locked onto the woman who'd accused her of kidnapping her own grandson. Her lips moved, her voice quiet but captured perfectly by the still live microphone. "Justice is blind but never deaf." The phrase struck the gallery like a spark in dried tinder. Gasps erupted, followed by the rapid staccato of cameras clicking. The court reporter's hands faltered for half a beat, then flew across the keys as though desperate to preserve the line. "Justice is blind but never deaf." It was more than a statement. It was a verdict of its own, etched not on paper, but into memory. Ashley lowered her head, her hair falling over her face. For the first time since the trial began, she looked small. Not powerful, not pitiful, just small. The bailiff gestured toward her to remain seated as the crowd began to disperse. She sank back into her chair, shivering faintly, the echo of Margaret's words surrounding her like chains. Margaret rose with quiet dignity. She gathered her handbag, placed her files inside, and straightened her blazer. The gallery parted for her as she walked down the aisle, whispers following her every step. A mother leaned to another and whispered, "That's not just a grandmother. That's justice in heels." The cameras trailed her until the courtroom door swung shut, leaving Ashley behind in the cold light of the fluorescent bulbs. Outside, the world would soon devour the story. Headlines would spread across digital feeds. "Grandmother wins defamation case against daughter-in-law. Court awards $20,000 in false kidnapping claim. H take." Attorney grandmother delivers chilling line. Justice is blind but never deaf. But inside that chamber, for the people who had witnessed it firsthand, it wasn't just a headline. It was the sound of justice itself, spoken with the quiet thunder of truth. And for Ashley Morgan, sitting alone in a sea of empty benches, it was the sound of consequences finally arriving after 2 long years of lies. The verdict did not end in the courtroom. It began there. When the gavel struck for the last time, Ashley Morgan's world collapsed in silence. The cameras followed Margaret Lewis out the door, but Ashley remained seated, staring blankly at the shredded tissue in her lap. Her attorney whispered something, advice, perhaps comfort, but she no longer heard. She had not only lost the case, she had lost her reputation. Within days, family court issued a ruling suspending her custodial rights, citing a demonstrated pattern of malicious falsehood that undermined the child's stability. Her son was placed temporarily in his father's custody, with visitation tightly monitored. The woman who once brandished the label of protective mother was now shadowed by the legal brand of dishonest accuser. Neighbors avoided her in the grocery store. Parents at the school whispered behind her back. The same reporters who once printed her trembling words now broadcast headlines about her deceit. Mother found guilty in false abduction claim. $20,000 lesson. The cost of a lie. Ashley closed her blinds, silenced her phone, and retreated into isolation. She had weaponized the law, and the law had struck back. For Margaret, the victory brought no joy, only clarity. She regained her dignity, her name restored, but scars remained. Her grandson, confused by months of poisonous whispers, still asked hesitant questions. "Nana, did you really try to take me away?" "Chi?" Margaret would kneel, hold his small hands, and answer with quiet patience. "No, sweetheart, I never took you away. I only came to bring you home. It would take time. Time to rebuild trust, time to mend the fracture between truth and memory." But for the first time in 2 years, she could begin. The case, however, grew far larger than Margaret or Ashley. News outlets latched onto it, amplifying the story beyond the county courthouse. Talk shows debated it. Radio hosts railed against it. Editorials warned of the growing epidemic of false abduction claims and custody disputes. Legal scholars dissected the trial, pointing to the ruling as a precedent-setting moment. Law journals published articles with titles like Lewis v. Morgan, a turning point in family law integrity and weaponized accusations. The need for reform. Sheriffs, judges in neighboring counties began citing the case in hearings. Attorneys invoked it to caution clients against filing frivolous claims. The words of the verdict spread beyond the walls of one courtroom. They became a shield for others standing accused in silence. And with that shield came stories. One father, wrongfully accused 3 years earlier of attempting to abduct his own daughter outside a school dance, saw his dismissed case revived. Inspired by Margaret's victory, he petitioned the court for damages against his ex-spouse. The footage of his innocence had once been overlooked. Now, under the glare of Lewis v. Morgan, it became undeniable. He was exonerated publicly, his name cleared at last. Another ripple spread closer to the heart of the courthouse itself. The young stenographer who had paused, ever so briefly during Ashley's testimony, the woman who had typed the words erratic, resisting protocol with clenched teeth, submitted her resignation 2 weeks later. In her letter, she wrote, "I no longer want to simply record injustice. I want to fight it." She enrolled in law school, declaring her intent to specialize in civil rights and family law. To colleagues, she said she had been inspired by Margaret's poise, her calm dismantling of lies, her ability to transform one case into a movement. The courthouse, too, bore the imprint of the trial. Months later, in a quiet ceremony attended by judges, attorneys, and families who had fought similar battles, a bronze plaque was unveiled in the main hall. The engraving caught the light, solemn and enduring. The Truth Hall. The dedication speech was short, but the meaning clear. May this hall remind us that truth is not fragile. It endures beyond lies, beyond fear, beyond time. Justice begins with truth. Ferv. Visitors paused before it daily. Jurors arriving for service, families waiting for hearings, even school children touring the building. It became more than a plaque. It became a symbol. Ashley's name became synonymous with warning. Judges referenced her case to parents. Do not let desperation lead you to Morgan's mistake. Promptly, attorneys used it in lectures. Remember, every false accusation risks becoming a Lewis v. Morgan. Her son, meanwhile, lived in the shadow of a divided story. One parent disgraced, one vindicated, and a truth he would grow to understand only with time. For Margaret, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. When asked by reporters if she felt vindicated, she never smiled. She only said, "Vindication is not the goal. Protection is. My grandson knows the truth now. That is enough." But those close to her knew it wasn't enough. She had tasted the fragility of justice and seen how easily it could be twisted. And though her personal battle was over, she began speaking publicly about reform, appearing at legal forums, warning others about the danger of weaponized lies in family disputes. Her words carried weight not because they came from an attorney, but because they came from a grandmother who had nearly been erased by a falsehood. In time, Lewis v. Morgan became more than a case citation. It became a parable whispered in courtrooms across the country. Do not lie. Do not weaponize. Do not turn the law into a blade against the innocent. For when truth rises, it does not simply restore. It transforms. The gallery that had once gasped at Ashley's accusations, then gasped again at her exposure, had borne witness to something larger than one woman's fall. They had watched a system confront itself, and when the doors of the courthouse closed that day, they left behind more than empty benches and echoes of a gavel. They left behind a legacy etched in bronze, a hall renamed, a truth reborn, the Truth Hall. And within its walls, the whisper of Margaret's words still lingered long after the cameras had gone. Justice is blind, but never deaf. The courthouse steps were crowded with cameras. Microphones jutted forward like bayonets. Reporters shouted over one another, their questions overlapping in a wall of noise. Margaret Lewis stood at the center, her gray blazer neat, her posture unshaken. The bronze plaque of the Truth Hall gleamed behind her, catching the last shards of afternoon light. For a moment she said nothing. She let the chaos roll over her, let the flashbulbs explode like lightning, let the murmurs swell. Then she lifted her chin and looked directly into the nearest camera lens, as though she were speaking not just to reporters, but to the world. Her voice was steady, carrying not the heat of anger, but the weight of conviction. Silence only feeds injustice. Lies kill faster than pain. Share this story so no parent or grandparent ever suffers in silence again. The words cut through the crowd, silencing the frenzy. Pens froze mid-scribble. A boom mic operator blinked, stunned. Even the murmuring families watching from the edge of the crowd straightened, as if they had been addressed personally. Margaret's eyes swept across the sea of faces. This case was never just about $20,000. It was never about a verdict written on paper. It was about something deeper. It was about whether lies can erase truth, whether manipulation can masquerade as justice, whether fear can be weaponized against the innocent. Her tone hardened, not louder but sharper. I stand here as a grandmother who was branded a kidnapper, and I stand here as an attorney who knows the law must be more than a weapon. It must be a shield. That shield belongs to every child, every parent, every grandparent who has been silenced by falsehood. Crap. Reporters leaned closer. Cameras zoomed in. So, share this story. Not for me. Not for Margaret Lewis. Share it for the father wrongly accused outside a school dance. Share it for the mother who lost custody because a lie went unchallenged. Share it for the child who has been taught to fear the very hands that once kept them safe. She paused, letting the weight settle. The silence was thick, broken only by the whirring of camera shutters. Then her voice softened, carrying a note of plea beneath the steel. Last, let this be more than a headline. Let it be a warning. Let it be a call. Because justice is not passive. It requires witnesses. And when the silent become witnesses, injustice cannot thrive. The crowd exhaled as though won. Questions flew again, but Margaret no longer answered. She had said what needed to be said. She turned from the cameras, her silhouette framed by the doors of the Truth Hall, her words already spreading into the world, words that would echo far beyond the courthouse, reshared, retold, and remembered. And with that, her story ceased to be hers alone. It became a call to purpose,